I wanted to thank you for taking the time to, sit down and, talk with me about history and historic sites. I tried to match my mug to the person. I went with a really classic, this is from Seagrove, and locally made, and it's beautiful and classic.
My favorite coffee mug at home is like that. So it's like handmade pottery, beautiful glaze. So you're right in the right direction.
I feel really good about that. So
I have a really good mug for a fake diner, which you're not going to be able to read.
I see not too sweet. What else does it say?
It says the not too sweet diner and bakery, and then in little quotes at the bottom it says easy sugar. And I'm a big baker and cook,
right?
But I really don't like things to be too sweet, and I'm always trying to make desserts that are like tart or sour or like buttery or like salty in some way. And so a friend of mine made me fake diner mugs.
You're funny.
Commemorating that desire.
I like it. To talk a little bit about your background about the site, and then also I was interested in talking a little bit about Stagville, the plantation, versus like plantations in Western North Carolina, and talking about like what's happening at the Vance Birthplace and people's reactions, and kind of see how similar or maybe different they are. But I was thinking we would start first so that people can get to know you a little bit better, is just saying a little bit about you,
Sure.
Your background. Like, I know that you're an amazing cook, but, how did you end up, what's your background? How did you get here?
So I've ended up in public history in a very roundabout way. I feel like I often have like classes of public history students or graduate students or something that come to my site or are working with me, and often they ask, what was your path into the field? And I often say, like, I can tell you my path into the field, but it's not something that anyone else is going to replicate, and I probably wouldn't recommend it necessarily. I grew up here in Durham, where my site is, and my family, going back for many generations, is from the coast, from eastern North Carolina, mostly in Carteret County. And I grew up here in the Durham area, kind of immersed in a community of Southern historians. So I really grew up in a world of Southern history and North Carolina history in particular. My father is a historian, and while he would not identify as a public historian, he refuses to take on that label. A lot of the work that he did when I was a child was focused on connecting history with the public in some way, which I would say is public history, but we'll let that stand. So, for example, when I was a child, he had a newspaper column for our local newspaper that was oral histories of folks from North Carolina. And so once a month for years and years of my childhood, he would interview a North Carolinian, and he would publish this column, which was basically them in their own words talking about something powerful that they had experienced. And this was everything from working class fishermen on the coast of North Carolina to politicians and activists to people from dancers, musicians, people from every walk of life, people who'd experienced a huge range of things. So I grew up basically in the backseat of the car, trekking across North Carolina every weekend to go hang out and sit in the, parlor with these folks and listen in to their stories. So I feel like the entry point for history for me was always personal stories. I, as a young person, was really interested in environmental science and in working and living on the coast of North Carolina in the towns where my family was from. Mm-hmm. And I worked sort of stumbled into museums as a consequence of that. So I was interested in the maritime world and coastal ecology and understanding the science of the ocean. And then, of course, right along with that went maritime history. So I ended up working at museums on the coast of North Carolina, and kind of stumbling into the history portion of it. I'll always give credit to the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum on Harker's Island, which is the first museum I ever worked for. And that museum does something that almost no other museum does, right? It's truly a community space and a gathering space and a space created by and for and of the people of Harker's Island and of the families that have been displaced from that area by gentrification and development. And so working there, I thought, museums are incredible. This is what I want to do with the rest of my life. Very quickly, of course, I realized this is not what most museums and historic sites are like. And by the end of my time in school, I had totally written off museum work for the most part. And I was very fortunate to encounter a legendary Durham historian, Leslie Brown, and in a very brief conversation with her the first time I met her, she, probably within 15 minutes of setting eyes on me, said, "You have to do public history work." And I immediately was like, "No, you don't know me. You don't know what you're talking about. There's no way in the world I would ever go back to museums or do public history." So I worked mostly in the food world for a while. I worked as a cheesemaker. I've worked for farms and dairies, and then I've also worked in cooking professionally in restaurants as a cook and a baker. And while I was working professionally as a cook here in Durham, I ended up stumbling onto a part-time position at Historic Stagville. And Stagville just pulled me right over again back into the world of public history. So I've been involved with the site for about 5 years now, and I've been the site manager since last spring, so about a year now.
I love the cheese component. When I first found that out about you, I was like, cheese. How can we combine these two worlds and have the museum and cheese?
I thought about that some. Part of the reason that I stepped away from cheese is that Southern identity and Southern place and Southern history are really important to me, and I've always defined what I wanted to do with my work, whether it was, Southern identity and Southern place in the environment and the landscape, or in the cultural history, or in the food, right? And the truth is, in most of the American South, we don't have a long-standing cheese-making tradition.
I know.
We've brought it in the modern day, but this is really not where our dairy legacy is buttermilk and it's butter, but it is for the most part not cultured cheese. And so there's a real limitation to how you can pursue a deep cultural legacy of cheese making in the American South. at least in the Piedmont and in the coast.
I feel like this really speaks to you, that you have thought so deeply about the interpretive nature, cheese, and I'm just no, but figure it out how we can eat cheese. I had someone ask me, how do I feel as a white woman trying to interpret and teach about slavery? How do you reckon with it?
Right. So I thought about this question a lot. I feel like I get asked it a lot by visitors, but also by community partners and lots of folks that I work with. Most immediate response I have to that question is that it's just yes, of course, this is an essential question, because I think the way that we approach interpreting any history, but especially any history that's about identity, and specifically in this case race, we can't do a good job at doing that work if we're not constantly engaged with our own identities, right? And with the identities of the other folks that we work with, and with the identities of our visitors, and how can we expect to comfortably or effectively facilitate interpretation about the history of race and racism in this country if we're not comfortable thinking about that within ourselves and within our coworkers, right? And these are often, especially for white people in this country, these are often conversations that we have been socially trained and conditioned to see as uncomfortable and as things that we're not supposed to talk about, right?
Right.
So all of that to say is that I think like constant engagement and intersection with that question is like part of the way that you do the work. Right. I think for me, there's a couple different ways that I, right now at least, think about that question. One is that the history of slavery is all of our history, right? It's part of the history of the United States. It's part of the history of the communities and the politics and the economy of everywhere that anyone lives in the United States in some way or another. Like it's a very deep white history of slavery as well, right? Of the people who were enslavers, of the people who perpetuated the system, who justified it, who took material wealth from that system. And so this is in many ways, right, everyone's story to tell in one way or another. And there can be different ways that we can communicate or that we can teach that story depending on our own backgrounds and our own identities. But this is a history that everyone can engage with and everyone can tell and teach, right? I also think that we know from the communicative work of interpretation, we know from our own work at Stagville, where we have a staff and volunteer base that includes both white and African American interpreters, that your identity really shapes how visitors respond to you and what kinds of conversations or interpretive moments you are able to facilitate depending on who your audience is. And so, as a white interpreter interpreting the history of Stagville, there may be certain conversations or certain approaches or certain moments that I can facilitate that might be more difficult or less open for an interpreter of color on our staff to facilitate, and exactly vice versa, right? And so having white interpreters interpret this story opens certain interpretive windows, and having interpreters of color does exactly the same thing. I think we do have to think very carefully about when this is a story of oppression, when this is a story of white enslavers benefiting from not only the labor of enslaved people and the wealth, but from ownership of that story, right? That part of the story of slavery is the story of white enslavers and the perpetuators of this system claiming total control of the historical narrative and of whose voice can be present in the record. And so we do need to think very carefully about the fact that it is insufficient to have only white interpreters interpreting that story, right? That we're going to miss part of the fullness and the complexity and the opportunities to teach this story to as many audiences and as many people as possible if we allow the interpretation of the story to be dominated only, perhaps even in majority, by white interpreters, right? And really what we find from interpretation, right, is that the more people of different identities we have teaching these stories, people of different age groups, people from different racial backgrounds, people from different regions of the country, people with different life experiences, the more interpreters we have teaching the story, the more depth and complexity and perspective we can add to the story. Because the conversations within our staff, within our volunteers, the different ways that people look at a primary source or think about a space at Historic Stagville or think about a response from their audience, that feeds like all of our ability to interpret the story, because I can listen to one of my volunteers and learn something from the way they've picked up on something in a space that perhaps I didn't perceive, and maybe there's something that has resonated with me in this letter that they didn't see, right? And vice versa. And so hopefully what ends up happening is that we have a more robust and honest and like full interpretation and interpretive experience for ourselves and for our audience through bringing as many people as possible into the fold, right?
Right.
Back, for example, at, the starkest reminder of this for me was talking with Dot Radford, who was the former site manager at Somerset Place, another plantation site in the Historic Sites Network here in North Carolina. And she told me about her experience of, she had students come to Somerset and do a study of visitors and their reactions and of the narrative that was presented in their tours.
Oh.
And she found that even though she had done the same training with all interpreters, and this is of course a time when Dot was trying to heavily alter the narrative of Somerset and to totally transform the narrative of that site to focus on enslaved people and their experiences. And Dot herself is a descendant of folks who were enslaved there. And she talked about the fact that even though she had done all the same training, even though the interpreters had all the same materials, that the visitors that came to her site still, she found that over time, white interpreters shifted back towards the baseline of the old, familiar, white-dominated narrative, and that no matter what training she provided for interpreters, at least at the time, over time, these studies found this divergence of reverting back to this dominant narrative that sort of continued to emphasize the perspective of the Collins family, who owned the Somerset plantation. And Dot's conclusion from that was that she began to script tours very heavily, right? So she basically said, everyone has to say the exact same words in order to try to stop this baseline drift. But we don't script our tours at Historic Stagville. That was not my takeaway from that. But it was very powerful to hear her speak about how insidious this is and how easy it is to drift back towards this narrative which has been embedded in our country for so many generations, particularly, obviously, in white historians and in sort of like cultural perceptions in white communities of what plantations are and what those spaces mean. And it's a real reminder of how much work we have to be sort of, that it's not something where you just flip a switch and you fix it, right? And it's something where, again, it's that constant reflection, constant listening to people around you, constantly bringing new voices into the room to help you see the drift and help you see the cracks, and constantly turning over and saying, where is this reversion happening? Because what Dot's story taught me so clearly was that drift is always going to be there, and sometimes you might be able to see it, and sometimes you might not even be aware of it. And so, again, you need as many people as possible, as many different perspectives in the room working on your narrative. I appreciate it when one of our interpreters or one of our volunteers or a member of the public gives us a critique and tells us this was hurtful, or this didn't work, or this wasn't well done in your interpretation, because so often that allows us to do better. And it tells me that when that member of the public or when that member of our volunteer corps comes to me or comes to someone else on our staff and says, this needs to change, that is actually an act of trust, right? Because they're saying that they trust our staff to listen, and they trust our staff to take their feedback seriously, and they trust our staff has the capacity to change this. And that's an incredible act of trust for someone from the public or perhaps one of our volunteers to come to us and ask for change in that way.
We're not there at Vance. People aren't even, they're not ready to ask the questions. And I don't know if that's necessarily a site or more if it's just this overall mentality that slavery didn't exist in Western North Carolina. Like people have, if it's not just specific to our site, but more of like, people feel, I think I get the vibe that they feel a little more comfortable accepting the fact of the big sprawling plantations. But when you start talking about, the Vances who had 18 enslaved people, they're like, oh, well, that's not that bad. That wasn't a plantation. It's bigger than that. It's bigger than this definition of numbers.
My staff and I were just having a conversation about this because we were talking about a story of a place where someone was enslaved, and we were talking about how different that person's experience was when they were, in this instance, the only person enslaved on that farm, compared to the stories that we tell at Stagville, where, and we were just talking about how, I guess, just circling around some of the things that you were just saying, of basically the ways in which plantation narratives are often the only narrative of enslavement that we encounter. This much broader narrative, right, especially here in North Carolina, where the majority of families who enslave people enslaved a very small number of people, nothing close to 50 people, let alone the 900 or 1,000 people who were enslaved by the families who owned Stagville. And that's a really different life and a different experience in many ways, while still obviously being within the same institution of slavery. Stagville, in our interpretation, is be cautious about how much we emphasize the extraordinariness of Stagville. So Stagville is one of the largest plantations in the state of North Carolina. The family who owns it eventually becomes some of the wealthiest people in the entire state. So it's very easy to present a narrative of Stagville that focuses on how many people were enslaved there and how massive this place was, and the amazing, massive amounts of capital that were taken out of it, and the massive amounts of wealth and power that were built on the back of that capital. And that's always going to be part of the story that we tell. But I think, our interpretive themes, the essence of the story that we're trying to tell, is really about the human experience of people who were enslaved and commodified by the system, and the way that those people resisted and suffered and experienced trauma and experienced labor, and the way that people lived at Stagville and other places. And when we encourage our visitors to think of Stagville as a place that was exceptional and somehow different than any other place around it, we actually diminish our ability to tell people, for people to build a connection between the story of someone who was enslaved at Stagville and the story of someone who was enslaved in their community, or on the land that they might own today, or where one of their ancestors was enslaved, or where one of their ancestors enslaved people. Right. Plantation story, and is a convenient way to draw a bright line between those places where slavery was evil, right, and where hundreds of people were enslaved. And as if drawing a nice, neat boundary around that plantation land means that everywhere else was untouched, right? And like I talked about at the beginning, this is a history that runs through all our communities, through many of our families, through many of our friends and neighbors and institutions that are around us today. And I think critically, right, like as we've talked about a lot in the institution of slavery within our sites, I just go back over and over and over and over again to Brian Stevenson and his public history work. Brian Stevenson comes into public history work from a background in criminal justice work and sentencing reform work. Right. And when he talks about his approach to public history, he talks about very clearly and transparently about shame, and that about part of the reason that we don't want to see these stories in our own family tree or in our own communities or on our own land is because we don't have good enough language and relationships to believe that there is anything that can come out of this history that is not shame and punishment. He says, in our personal lives, we understand the importance of remorse and regret. But then he goes on to say, we don't understand that when it comes to this history, right? And I love this little quote from him where he talks about this as if how we think about our personal relationships as opposed to public history. And he says, you show me two people who've been in love for 50 years, and I'll show you two people who've learned how to apologize to one another when they hurt each other and when they fall down. We acknowledge that that's a stronger union. In the criminal justice context, we insist on it. We insist on offenders expressing their shame before we trust them again. I don't have an interest in humiliating people. I don't want to punish this country for these decades of abuses. I want to liberate us. I actually believe in redemption and in recovery and in rehabilitation. We cannot get reconciliation without the truth. We cannot get there if we don't acknowledge what it is we're struggling to recover from. And I love the metaphor of the marriage that he uses there, right? Which is that we understand that it means that your friendship or your marriage is stronger when you know how to apologize and to talk about the things that you've done wrong and to move beyond that, right? And we don't always have as good of a language for talking about history that way, I think. That got way off topic. I'm
Vera.
Sorry.
I'm like, are you trying to make me cry on Quarantine's Historians?
No. Interpretation really is, like, in its best version of itself, it's emotional work.
It is.
Empathy work, right? And that is, like, incredible work to be doing in the world. And you can, I think part of the reason that I didn't, go running into museums when I first encountered them is that you can spend a lot of time as a visitor or as a staff person in museums and historic sites and not encounter the acknowledgement or not have found the space where you realize that what you're doing and what you need to learn to do better and what the public is doing with you and what your coworkers and your colleagues are doing alongside you is emotional work and is empathy work.
Right.
And it means something that gets, like, kind of big or kind of cheesy or kind of emotional or like kind of makes you tear up a little bit. But, like, that's also the best thing about what we do, right?
I literally have right here in my notes, best parts, ? Another thing I wrote down was I wrote down every day and I wrote down comfortable. And those were just words that came to mind when you were talking about, that big grand picture of the plantation and Stagville and the whole grandiose thing. And, I think that allows people to be more comfortable because they're farther removed from it than, like, more of the everyday, which is why I wrote it down. Like, there were people living every single day this way, the enslavers and the enslaved, and what was that like? And I think people can relate to the everyday more, which forces them to grapple with some of those feelings that we've talked about. And I think public historians even begin to help with that. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're there, like, we're making people think about these things and how do we create this space and make sure we're doing a good job in creating this space where people can kind of address that uncomfortableness and grapple with it. Because for so long, like you said, we've been allowed to, especially white people, have been, like, not forced to be uncomfortable. We've had control over the narrative to make it so that we are comfortable in all of the aspects of it, which I think is why when it wasn't scripted at Somerset, people naturally went back to that other narrative. And I think it's because we naturally gravitate towards what makes us feel good, right? Like, we don't want to be in day out in something that makes us not feel good. But, and I think that's what's so exhausting about museum work and public history work and interpretation. And, it makes me think about, the training that we went to in Charleston. Shortly after that, I talked about in another interview where we created a notebook at the site where people can come back and write down, maybe interactions that they've had, not necessarily difficult ones, but just any interaction they want to talk more about. And
I have one of those too.
And I think it's really helpful, and when you start talking about the emotional side of it. We have had some staff that have people make comments or say things on tour, and maybe they weren't ready at that time with a response, and so they want to discuss it, and then we can we work through it.
And when you're responding in that moment, this training, this brainstorming with colleagues, this preparing in any way you can, I'm not trying to say as a manager, oh, you're going to get to a place where you're not emotionally affected by this action or by this comment or by this response. That's not what we're trying to say. But what I'm trying to do as a manager is say, here are tools so that you can identify what's happening in a situation, and you can be strategic, whether it's about your safety or the safety of visitors or the best interpretive way to respond or to create an interpretive dialogue in this moment. And then that strategy actually gives you a way to distance yourself, to protect yourself in that moment, and to safely emotionally decompress when you're not still in the heat of that moment or still in the immediate response with someone who is emotional or who is assertive or aggressive in some way, and that your space with your colleagues, your space with your friends or family, or a walk in the woods, or beautiful music, or whatever it is, then that becomes the space where you can feel that emotion and work through it, and be a colleague with us through that, in a space where you're protected and you're supported, and you're not the public face of Stagville State Historic Site, or expected to be facilitating an experience for other people, which is what an interpretive program is. So I don't know, it's hard, complicated work that we just keep trying to puzzle through ways to do better, right?
It really is.
I feel so much better equipped to do this work now than I did a year ago, and I felt better a year ago than I did a year before that. And I can just walk backwards and through my time working in historic sites, and I hope that I can give some of that to other people, and also that curve continues, right? I would say that's part of why that might be my best part of the work, actually, for the question you had, which is the creativity and the discovery and the innovation of figuring out, here's this new way to think about this, here's a new way to talk about this, here's a new way to be a team with the people around me and be better at doing this work or understand the work better. And of course that translates into the visitor experience and into interpretation, but I might love that part of it even more than I love that really good interpretive moment with, one group or one visitor. But might be a tie.
Oh man. Well, I think that is a perfect, we've kind of come full circle. I think that's a perfect way to kind of end it. I say we just leave it right there.
Perfect. Sounds good to me.
But wow, we've covered a lot. And like you said, there's stuff we've talked about. You could go on. I mean, we could spend all day talking about it. But I think it's just such wonderful insight. And again, I love talking to you about public history and interpretation. So thanks for being part of this. And I'm sure we'll try and do it again. Maybe next year we'll touch base and we'll see where we're at.
Okay, I just promised that there was going to be a lot of growth and change. So
so you get on that. No pressure.
Yeah. Oof. Okay. We'll see.
But anyway, all right. Well, thank you so much, and I'm going to let you get back to your day, and I will talk to you soon.
On to my next Zoom meeting.
Nice. All right. I'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.